Good morning and welcome to South Point Church Online. Hey, we want to welcome you from wherever you're watching at. If you're watching locally, maybe you're watching nationally, you might even be watching globally. And so we just want to say thanks for being here today. My name is Matt. I'm part of the team here at South Point, and we're just fired up that you're joining us today. Hey, I also want to say you might be excited about the recent series that we're in called God of the Underdogs. Today, we're wrapping up the series, and I want to go all the way back to week 1 to explain why you might still be excited about this series. And we're going to put it up on the screen, and it's this right here. All of us will be an underdog at some point in life. Listen, if you showed up this morning on your phone or on your laptop or on your Apple TV, right? Listen, whether you're kind of mad about this whole God and Jesus thing, maybe you grew up in a spiritual different direction, maybe you've been a follower of Jesus all your life, right? But all of us at some point will be an underdog in life. At some point, all of us will face a label that we can't shake. All of us will face a weakness that we can't beat, and all of us will have a circumstance beyond our control that we can't control. What we've been talking about over the last 4 to 5 weeks isn't a religious issue, it's a human issue, something that all of us will face. Now, if you're just catching us or joining us today, don't worry, today we'll stand alone. If you happen to miss any of the previous weeks, that really is okay. You can watch on demand and catch up either on our website or on our YouTube channel. And today we just want to kind of like step right into what the subject is. And it's kind of this difficult truth, but it's a truth I know that you've seen, and if we're really honest, that you've probably experienced. And we're going to put it up on the screen, and it's this right here. Ending up in a painful circumstance is unavoidable. Again, this isn't a religious issue. This isn't a spiritual issue. This is a human issue for all of us. Ending up in a painful circumstance is unavoidable. This isn't an if question. This is a when question. And the reason that ending up in a painful circumstance is unavoidable is because that you and I live in a broken world. Maybe you just want to type in broken. Listen, all of us would admit the world doesn't work the way it was. And if the world doesn't work the way it's supposed to, right, at some point, even though through no choice of our own, just through chance, we'll end up in a painful circumstance. And not only is the world broken, if we're really honest, and you know this, and I know this, all people are flawed. Doesn't matter how good we try to be, all of us are flawed. So at some point, we'll have a failure that will put us into a painful circumstance. And so this isn't an if question, this is a when question. All of us, you, me, we, all of us will end up in a painful circumstance that is unavoidable. And here's how we end up there. So I wanted to show you kind of the screen, and we're going to put up here on the screen this little diagram that we end up in painful circumstances either by choice or by chance. And I want to give you an example from my own personal life about how I ended up in a painful circumstance, one time by choice and one time by chance, but they were both kind of the same thing. Now, if you've been around South Point, you know my kind of favorite saying that I like to say, true story. So thank you for those of you that put that in the chat. But both of these true stories come about my car buying experiences, but both of them came about 15 years apart. The first choice in buying a used car when I was about 19 years old. And back then, this was almost at the start of the internet, I was buying a car out of one of those magazines. I didn't look at it in the daylight. I didn't test drive it, and I didn't have a mechanic look at it. I just signed on the dotted loan for the car, got a loan, paid the person off, and got the car that night in the dark. Well, you can guess what happened. About a month later, a car I still owed money on, the engine blew up. And I ended up in a painful circumstance because I made a really poor choice. I just made a bad choice. Now, fast forward about 15 years later, through no fault of my own, I was just driving, doing my Young Life thing, helping high school and middle school students, and someone crossed a double line around a curve and hit me head on and totaled my minivan, right? And so I tried to make the responsible decision, and I was going to buy another used minivan, and this time I went in the daylight. This time I took it on a test drive, and this time I even paid a mechanic lots of money to come and be with me to inspect this car. And about a month later, this car had multiple problems and I had to get rid of it. One time I ended up in a painful circumstance by choice, and another time by chance. And I bet if we're all honest here today, that I bet that you've ended up in a painful circumstance, either by choice or by chance. Maybe for you, the chance is that you're one of those people that like looks out after your diet, you eat well, you exercise, and you were surprised when the doctor gave you a diagnosis of high blood pressure, even though you run a lot and exercise and eat well. You just had the bad luck or bad chance of hereditary. Maybe for you, it was in a career or in a job. I mean, you were there for a decade plus and you've been a model employee. And it wasn't because you weren't a good employee, but either due to business or economic reasons, your company shut down and you found yourself unemployed and out of a job, not because of a choice, but just by chance. Maybe you have an extended family member. You've loved them, you've cared for them, you've supported them, you've been there for them over and over and over. And the reason your relationship is ruined is because of their dysfunction and not your choice. If we're all honest, I bet all of us here today have a story where we end up in a painful circumstance by chance. Now, this is the harder part, right? Like none of us really wants to admit this, right? But all of us will end up in a painful circumstance because of a choice. Maybe for some of us here, it's we didn't manage our money, and so now our money is managing us. And that wasn't a good choice. Maybe the choice was to say yes when we really should have said no. Like we just should have said no. Saying yes in that moment to that relationship or to that thing just was unhealthy. It was wrong. And you're still bearing the consequences of that today, right? And for some, it may have been a choice to take a shortcut. Like, listen, we know shortcuts aren't right. And maybe it was a shortcut that was against the rules or against the law. And you thought no one would see, no one would ever find out. And someone did. And you ended up in a painful circumstance. So the reality is that all of us, regardless of whether we're just spiritually curious, maybe we maybe just feeling out this whole Jesus thing, or maybe we're like all in. All of us will end up in a painful circumstance. It's unavoidable. And here's why talking about it today is so important. It leads you and I to a truth that all of us have experienced. And we're going to put it up here on the screen. Often, our natural response to painful circumstances is to lash out and hurt others and ourselves. I mean, have you ever noticed that our natural response to pain isn't one of like, woo, that felt good, or joy, or happiness, or kindness, or empathy? No, our natural response to pain is to lash out, and we usually hurt others, and often in the process, we'll hurt ourselves. I was catching up with my adopted dad the other day on the phone, and I don't know how we got on the subject, but he was telling me a story of when he was younger. He was in his teenage years and he was at the dentist and they had put him under. I think they were doing some work on his wisdom teeth or doing something and pulling a teeth. And he said when he woke up from the anesthesia, he felt a little bit weird and he noticed that his hand was hurting. And when he looked down at his right hand, he noticed he had some stitches in his hand. And the nurses were giggling. And so he asked the nurses, he's like, hey, why do I have stitches on my knuckle and why does it hurt? And where's the dentist? And they said, listen, while you were under, the doctor was pulling out the tooth and it must have had pain because under anesthesia, you jumped up and punched and knocked the dentist out. Now he finished pulling out the teeth and we sewed you up, but he's never going to see you again. If we're really honest, our natural response to pain is often to lash out. And in doing so, we hurt others and we hurt ourselves. I mean, if we're just really honest, dealing with pain and circumstances that we can't control, we often don't do it well. And this is the part that's hard to say, but necessary because you know it's true. And like, listen, I know it's true, right? Like, listen, when you and I hurt others, when you and I hurt ourselves, we never end up with the life that we're meant for. And we'll never end up with the life that we want. So it leaves us in kind of this conundrum, right? Like, listen, painful circumstances are unavoidable because of chance or because of choice. Listen, we're flawed and we live in a broken world. We're going to end up in a painful circumstance. And if our natural response is to lash out and create pain, then it's natural to mean that we will end up not with the life that we want or the life that we're meant for. And it leaves us like, listen, this isn't a not so fun subject. You're not going, woo, this was a great subject to talk to. But since it's something that all of us will face, we need to answer this question, which I believe we'll do to get today together. We're going to put it up here on the screen. It's this. How do we avoid lashing out when stuck in a painful circumstance we can't control? Because no matter why you showed up today, I believe this to be true about all of us. Everyone wants to have the life that they were meant for, and everyone wants to have a life worth living. So we need to answer the question, how do we avoid lashing out when we're stuck in a painful circumstance we can't control? Because the reality is all of us are going to end up there. And if we're really honest today, some of you've been in this already. You've gone, yeah, like what I'm going to talk about today, you're going to go, yeah, that's true. I've experienced that. For some of you, you're right in the middle of it, and this is going to speak to you, and you're hurting, and you're going, I'm hoping to hear something that will make a difference. And for others, maybe it's so far removed, you've forgotten what that pain is like, but I just want you to know, love doesn't promise us a pass from problems. And so in the future, we might experience more pain because we live in a broken world and we're flawed people. Now, here's the most amazing news is listen, the answer that we're looking for to this question is found in a shocking and a surprising way. The answer that you and I are looking for aren't what you would typically expect to find the answer to be. And maybe for some of you, you think the answer to this is something like, hey, try harder, which is often the religious answer. But what if I told you today that trying harder isn't the answer? Maybe you would expect me to say something like, hey, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Don't be a buttercup. Like just, woman, man up or whatever up and just make it happen. But that's not the solution answer. And some of you might be thinking, well, am I supposed to positively think my pain or my problems away? And that's not the solution. You see, God, the creator of the universe, he knew that all of humanity, no matter where you're at, what continent and what generation, that each and every one of us would experience painful circumstances that are unavoidable, that we can't control, either because of fate or because of our failure. And the shocking answer to this is something why I'm so excited to share with you this morning. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 5 lines in recorded history that are some of my favorite 5 lines of all the historical record. Matter of fact, these 5 lines come from a first century historian. His name is Luke. Now you have to understand, in the first century, Luke was a physician and he recorded the history about Jesus. And what's really cool is one of the modern academics, and he was great in archaeological, is Sir William Ramsay. And here's what he said about Luke. He said, archaeology, the science of archaeology, proves that Luke was a world-class historian and makes his references, his kind of story of history, trustworthy and reliable if we believe anything. And today we're going to look at the historical account from Luke. And we find this towards the end of Luke in Luke 23. And what I want to do is kind of set the stage for what we're going to look at, these 5 lines in the historical record that I think change all of human history. There was this Jesus had been born, right? And he had lived this amazing life. He had loved and cared for people. And the people that he often fought with the most were the religious leaders of the day. And you know how the gospel goes, is that he was abandoned. He was betrayed. He went through 4 different trials and was found innocent, but he was unjustly condemned and he was unjustly tortured. And he was sentenced to the death penalty on a cross known as crucifixion in the first century. And he's hanging on the cross with 2 other guys. And this is where you pick up some of the most precious and amazing 5 lines in human history. And we're going to take a look at it. Luke 23, 38 through 43, and it says this: one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. So, at that time, when Jesus was crucified, the death sentence by cross, right? There were 2 other thieves that were crucified with him that day, one on his left and one on his right. And one of them started hurling insults. And he was in pain. And he said, listen, if you're really the Messiah, then get us out of this jam. If you really are God and are who you say you are, get us out of this situation. I don't care how I got here. It doesn't matter. We're in the same pain. You should fix this. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? So the thief on the other side of Jesus responds. He hears him cursing and yelling at Jesus and trying to manipulate him and control him into bailing him out. And he finally just steps in and he says, listen, hey, don't you get it? Don't you realize that we're under the same punishment that he is? Don't you get that? And then it goes on to tell us this a few lines later. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. It's amazing that in all the historical records of Jesus, that at every trial, the centurion and even the thief all say the exact same thing. Jesus is innocent. He doesn't deserve to be in a place paying a criminal's death. And we'll get to that in a bit. There's some good news there. And then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come in to your kingdom. And it's kind of this request as he's hanging there, he's dying. They probably don't have much longer to live. They know the Sabbath is coming, the Passover's coming. They know what the Romans typically do. They break the legs of anyone hanging on a cross so that they die quickly. They knew that their time was short. And yet this thief makes this appeal to Jesus. And he simply asks him a favor. Would you remember me when you come in to your kingdom? And I think this last line in the historical record is one of the most powerful lines in all of history that should give you, should give me, and should give we hope. And it's one of the most powerful verses in all of Scripture. We're going to put up here. And it says, Jesus answered him, truly. And so Jesus wants to make sure he knows something crystal clear. He says, hey, I'm about to tell you a truth. You don't have to doubt it. This is fact. Today, you will be with me in paradise. You will be with me. 5 lines, we see this amazing picture of something that is true about life. Now, here's the thing. Now, I want to kind of stop and I'm going to kind of go back through those things, but I'm just going to kind of explain what they do. And the first thing I want to explain is what I love about the historian Luke, right? Is Luke doesn't whitewash history. Like, listen, think about this. Jesus got it all right in life. Like, think about that. I mean, Jesus loved God. Jesus loved people. Jesus always did the right thing. He cared for the poor and the oppressed and he healed people. I mean, even if you aren't into a Christianity, most people will go, man, Jesus is awesome. The world would be a better place if there were more people like Jesus. Jesus is what is right, right? Jesus got it all right, but he still ended up in a painful circumstance. And the thief next to Jesus, well, he got it all wrong, and he ended up in a painful circumstance. And what I love about these 5 lines from the historian Luke is this, is that he tells you and I the truth. It's one of the reasons that I love the Bible. It's one of the reasons that I'm a follower of Jesus, is that he doesn't play make-believe or pretend. He says, don't you see? Jesus got it all right, and he still ended up in a painful circumstance. This guy got it all wrong, and he ended up in a painful circumstance. But here's the good news, because as you get through the rest of this event in history, that doesn't become the defining thing. Something else does. And so as you and I, we will face painful circumstances, sometimes because of chance, sometimes because of our choices. Whether it's fate or failure, all of us will end up in a painful circumstance. Love is not a pass from problems. The grace found in Jesus saves us from the punishment that our wrongdoing deserves, but it is not a pass from problems in this world. And so the first thing we can kind of learn from these 5 lines in history is this. I'm going to put it up on the screen. It's this. We're going to say number 1 is, I just want to say everyone experiences painful circumstances due to fate and failure. Like this is, you've experienced this. I've experienced this. Like we've all experienced this. This is a reality. On to point 1, we're going to say this. Hostility harms, right? Like there's Jesus. I mean, I want you to think about this, right? Like crucifixion was one of the most horrific ways to die. It was a criminal's death. I don't know if you know this, but in first century, did you know that a Roman citizen could not be crucified because the death was considered so shameful and painful and degrading that a Roman citizen could not be executed that way? Like it was horrific. I mean, you need to think about how horrific and painful this torture, this death sentence on a cross was. Jesus had been abandoned and betrayed by his disciples. He was naked in front of his family and friends that did show up. He was in horrific pain as he had to, his bloodied back, he had to pull up on the nails to be able to breathe. And he was alone. For the only time in history, he was separated from his heavenly Father and the Holy Spirit. And in that moment where Jesus was in the most pain that he would ever experience in all of eternity, someone was hostile. The other thief started raining down curses on him and trying to manipulate him, controlling and saying, if you're really the Messiah, if you really were this, and kind of taunting him and trying to manipulate Jesus into helping him. And here's what you and I know. Hostility harms. When you and I are in pain and we lash out and respond with hostility, we harm those that we love, we harm those that we're meant to love, and if we're really honest, we harm ourselves. You see, here's what happens is when we end up in a painful circumstance, we often will pass that pain along. We go into self-preservation mode. I mean, think about it this way. Have you ever had like surgery or been cut and someone bumps into you? You don't go, oh, I know you didn't mean to hurt me. No, what you usually do is you punch them, you yell at them, or you cuss, right? Like you push them away and go, why are you trying to hurt me? It's because pain will often cause us to lash out in a response where we pass pain on. And what's true about physical pain is true about the pain that we experience in life. And I don't know about you, but I can bet almost anyone watching this doesn't want to have the legacy that this one thief does. Like in his dying moments, he was that person, right? The guy who was cursing and giving Jesus a hard time. That's not the legacy that any of us watching today would want. And that's exactly what hostility leads to, a legacy that none of us want. Which leads into observation number 2 that we're going to put up on the screen is this. Humility helps. I mean, think about the thief who stuck up for Jesus and said to the other criminal. And what I love is he was humble. He was honest. He had some true humility. See, he probably had a story. I mean, he was a criminal. Had death sentence. I mean, something in his story didn't go right. But he was humble and honest enough to admit, while this story explains how he got there, he realized his story didn't excuse him being there. And he admitted to Jesus and to the other thief, we're here because we deserve to be here, but Jesus doesn't deserve to be here. And here's what I love. Just in one moment, he redefines his life through a moment of empathy and compassion. While one thief is being hostile and he's passing harm on, the other thief passes help on. Despite his pain, despite his story, and despite his circumstances, he chooses to help. He chooses to pass on something that is helpful and good, not to pass on something that is hurtful. And he sticks up for Jesus. Now, if you and I were saying, well, which one of those two would we want to be? What kind of legacy we want to leave behind for our families and for our friends, for history? All of us would pick the second thief, the one who stuck up for Jesus, regardless of where you are with spiritual matters, right? But that doesn't solve the problem, as it seems like fate or failure was going to win, because both thieves, the one that was hostile and the one that had humility, both were in a painful circumstance. And this is where we get to brag on Jesus. This is where we get to make an observation about Jesus that changes everything about ending up in a painful situation. Regardless if we get there by chance, regardless if we get there by choice, and if we're really honest, some of them we get into because of both. But this is where we get to the answer. We have hope in Jesus, which is number 3. We have hope in Jesus. Now, I want you to kind of think about something. Has anyone ever hurt you? And I mean like you love them, you cared for them, and they just did you dirty. They just did you wrong. How did that make you feel? I'm sure you didn't feel like helping them when they hurt you because they created pain when you were for them and you loved them. And here's what's amazing as I brag a little bit about Jesus. Now, I understand that when people watch this, we have people all across the spectrum. And when I say Jesus, I want you to understand, I'm not talking about a pastor. I'm not talking about a church organization or a church building or even a religious institution. I'm talking about a person named Jesus. Now, Jesus showed up. So think about this. Like God, the creator, created humanity to be in a relationship with him, right? And what was our response? And God being God, knew that love required a choice. And what choice did humanity make? Is to rebel and tell God, you know what? No, thank you. We're going to push you away. I'm sure that created hurt in the heart of God. And not only did we rebel against God and tell God to go pound sand, we began to hurt each other. And it would have been easy for God to lash out in hurt and pain to humanity. But instead, here's one of the most amazing things. This is the shocking. This is the thing that no one saw coming, is that God became a human. And he showed up in the most horrific, painful, harmful, hardest circumstance ever. He showed up Even in his dying breath, Jesus was helping someone who might not necessarily have deserved help, but he gave it willingly because that's who he is. Despite us hurting him, he showed up to help us because he loves you. He loves me. He doesn't want fate or failure to define us or those painful circumstances to be the permanent answer to our destiny. And then here's the second thing about Jesus, and it's so really awesome. I love what it says. Jesus says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me. You see, Jesus shows up. Listen, I want you to know today, maybe today's message is God trying to show up in your pain, in your circumstance. Maybe it was a phone call. Maybe a friend showed up in your life. Maybe it was someone who stepped in, who reached out to your family member. But I believe whenever we're in painful circumstances, is that God reaches out to us in the midst of our pain to show up to be with us. And what's amazing is Jesus showed up in the most painful circumstance to be with the thief. And here's what's so amazing. Jesus showed up in the thief's pain so that the thief could show up in Jesus's goodness. I mean, that's the whole gospel, right? I mean, the gospel just really means good news, right? That's what the Greek word for gospel means, is it's just good news. I mean, that is the good news that comes from God, is that God shows up in our mess so that we can show up in his goodness. And he paid a price for our failures. He paid a price for all of humanity breaking the world and for our personal failures. He stepped in and he paid our price. He showed up in our mess so that we could show up in his goodness. And I love what he says, today you will be with me. This isn't about religion or religiosity. It's about a relationship that we were designed for. He says, today you're going to be with me. I've showed up in your pain. I've showed up to suffer alongside of you so that you can show up and be alongside of me in my goodness and wholeness and rightness. I mean, that is what's so amazing. And here's why we can have hope in Jesus. Listen, I've done lots of historical research, and most legitimate historians will tell you there are 3 facts about Jesus. Jesus lived, Jesus died, and the tomb of Jesus is empty. Most historians, most theologians would all go, those are historical facts. We may disagree about what those facts means, but the good news is when Jesus told him, he said, today you're going to be with me in paradise. You see, Jesus conquered both fate and failure. You see, the cross is empty. Sometimes you'll go into churches and you'll see like Jesus on the cross. The good news is they took Jesus off the cross. He isn't there. And they buried him in the tomb. And here's the even better news. Jesus is in the tomb because he conquered hell and death. The good news is the reason that Jesus was able to provide help to the thief is because he was going to conquer what you and I couldn't conquer. And it leads us to a simple solution today. Now, the simple solution that I'm going to give us all today, that when you and I end up in a painful circumstance that we can't control, it's just simple. It's not going to be fluffy, but I just want to put up on the screen, and here it is. We need to accept that we can't avoid all the painful circumstances, but we can choose our responses. I mean, listen, there's no way between how busted the world is and how broken we are, or you can flip it, no matter how broken the world is or how busted we are, at some point, all of us are going to end up in a painful circumstance. Now, through actions and choices, we can try to avoid as many, but at some point, we'll end up in some. And so avoiding it isn't the solution. Choosing our response is. I mean, at the end of the day, all of us are going to be like one of those 2 thieves that were crucified with Jesus. We'll end up in a painful situation. Matter of fact, if we're really honest, life gives us a bunch of little pains, and we end up with a certain amount of pain over our life. And for some of us, we may choose the choice that the first thief chose, which was self-preservation. He wanted to pass his pain on to protect himself and try to control and to manipulate Jesus into doing something that would have actually kept that man from what he really needed, which was fate and failure being defeated by the substitution that Jesus paid for our wrong. He thought he knew better, and so he went into self-preservation mode. And I get it. Pain can drive us into self-preservation mode. Like, I get it. But that choice will cause us to lash out. And when we lash out, we hurt ourselves and we hurt others. Or we can take the second choice, That of humility, to admit that our world is broken and to admit that we're flawed and that there was one who was innocent and his name is Jesus and his tomb is empty, who desires to be in a relationship with us. And he paid a price for our brokenness, for our failures. And then he conquered something that you and I could not conquer. You see, fate and failure is something that human beings haven't been able to beat on their own. We're always leaving a legacy based on fate and failure. And here's the most amazing thing about Jesus, is because the tomb is empty and because Jesus isn't on the cross, our painful circumstances are only temporary. They are not permanent. And so we'll have to make a choice between self-preservation or surrender to Jesus. And the choice that we make will leave a legacy. You know, over this series, we've been talking about how we're all going to face a label that we can't shake. We've talked about how we're all going to have a weakness that we can't beat. And today we talked about, hey, listen, we're all going to face a circumstance that we can't control. Like, listen, instead of hiding, instead of pretending, let's just address the truth so that you and I know how to face it. And so if I was going to sum up the whole series, here's how I would sum it up, and we're going to put it up on the screen. It's this: letting Jesus lead our responses. See, if we let Jesus lead our responses to the labels, if we let Jesus lead our responses to our weaknesses, if we let Jesus lead our response to the circumstances, it will rob fate and failure. Listen, fate and failure are going to happen to all of us. I know this. It has happened to me. Listen, some of you might be going, you're a pastor, you can talk about this. If you've been around South Point long enough, I have shared that fate has not been kind to me. And I've also shared that, listen, I have my fair share of horrible failures, some so bad I'll never share on camera, right? Like, listen, so you and I, we're in the same bucket. Fate and failure has happened to us all. But if we let Jesus lead us, he will rob fate and failure of their power to define our destiny. Instead of lashing out, if we choose to let Jesus lead our response, we'll end up with a legacy that we want. We'll end up with the legacy that we were meant for. I was thinking about how to close this message and telling a story about kind of pain and circumstances that you can't control, and how sometimes our responses to those can create more pain in others. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about growing up and some of the things that had happened to me, parents getting divorced, my mom taking her own life, being sent to a counselor who was a child molester, getting incarcerated at 12 and a half, being physically abused by a stepdad. I mean, just things that shaped me before I was the age of 13. And as I look back at my life, I see some similarities to what I just saw on the two crosses. I was the first thief. I had gone through life, and because of fate and because of my failures, I ended up in some painful circumstances. And I was that guy yelling at God and yelling at Jesus. If you really loved me, you wouldn't have let this happen. And so I lashed out at the world. I lashed out at anyone close to me. And what I discovered is in my lashing out, not only did I hurt others, I hurt myself. And I realized that I was going to end up with a life that I wasn't meant for and that no one would want. And I wish I could tell you that when I discovered the truth, that there's a God who loves us, a God who was so loving that he was willing to step into my pain. I mean, think about that. God sent heaven's best, Jesus, to step into the most painful, horrific situation. He doesn't answer the why question, but he steps into the how much he loves us. When I grasped a hold of that, I surrendered to that, to passing on that pain. And I thought when I surrendered, that meant like life would be cheery and good from there on. And here's the reality that I've discovered. As I follow Jesus, it is a daily choice to let him lead my responses. I mean, since becoming a pastor, I had an illness that almost impacted me for 2 years. We had a miscarriage, bunch of other things, ended up in the hospital. I've had some issues with families. Like, there's been some just significantly painful things that I just don't share in public. And have had the ability or the chance to respond in a way that would just pass that pain on. And sometimes I have, and other times I haven't. But I know this, that I don't want fate, the bustedness of this world, or my failures to define me. I wanted to be defined by a relationship with Jesus. Because when I let Jesus define my responses, I end up with the life that I want. I end up with the life that I'm meant for. And today, If you ever get yourself in a circumstance that is painful, that you can't control, let Jesus define or lead your responses. And then fate and failure has no power over your destiny. Jesus will determine your destiny. He stepped into your pain and my pain so that we could step in to his goodness. So here's a challenge that I want to leave us all with. And I always say this every week. I realize that all of us are kind of in different stages in kind of our faith journey. And so I know some of you are kind of like, hey, I don't even know about God and Jesus. Like, I don't really know where I am. And that's okay. And so for some of you today, the first step might just be acknowledging that you've had a painful circumstance. Maybe that you're in a painful circumstance, or just going, you know what? I know I'm going to face a painful circumstance. Sometimes the first step to solving a problem is admitting that we might have experienced a painful circumstance that is causing us to lash out at others. There's others of you here, you might be going like, yeah, I believe in God. Like, I've said yes to Jesus, but there are pieces that I'm holding back. And for you today, here would be my challenge, is to ask God in prayer to help you. You know, and here's what I've discovered. When I've been in painful circumstances, I spent time praying to God. And if I'm really honest, sometimes God changes circumstances in a way that I never imagined. And then sometimes the circumstances, they just don't change. What I do know is that when I talk to God about the painful circumstances, something on the inside of me changes. So maybe that's the step that you would take, is to pray and to talk to God about your painful circumstance. And there's a third group of people. You're kind of the all-in group of people. And you've been following Jesus for a while. And what I've talked about today isn't really new to you. And you're going, well, what step can I take? And I would ask that you would be like the thief number 2, that you would take the pain that's happened in your life and you would use that to help others. What I've discovered is the pain that we experience, and if we deal with it appropriately, can often help us comfort people who are going through similar things. Is there someone who's going through a painful circumstance that you don't need to give advice to? You don't need to tell them what to do. You just need to come alongside and be with them in the midst. To not pass along hurt or harm, but to pass along help. Because at the end of the day, God is a God of the underdog. Because of Jesus, there is no label that will have to define us. Because of Jesus, our weaknesses will not define us. And because of Jesus, there is no circumstance that the empty tomb can't conquer. That because of Jesus, regardless of fate or our failures, we can end up with the life that we're meant for and the life that we want. All because of this one named Jesus. Let me pray for us. Hey God, thank you. Thank you that despite the labels either we give ourselves or are given to us, God, despite our weaknesses, God, the real ones and the ones that might be fake, that God, you step into our story. God, regardless of the circumstances, some because of our choices, our failures, some because of just chancing that it happened, that God, you choose to step into our story and love us. God, thank you because of the empty tomb. Our destiny is secure, God. God, because you are willing to step into our pain, we can step into your goodness. Not because we earned it or worked for it, but because that's who you are and you love us. God, help us to respond in a way that is led by Jesus, so we pass along goodness and help and not harm to ourselves and to others. This is our hope and our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. And we hope that you never forget, you matter deeply to God.